Hello, everybody. We are back. Unit 9, Social Psych. Here we're going to be focusing on, and the title of your notes is going to be Group Behavior. Here we're just going to focus on what happens with our behavior people's behavior when they get in a group that tends to be a little bit bigger than two people. Okay, first one is going to be social facilitation. And social facilitation happens when, I'm writing this down, is when other people are observing us, okay? Usually like a classroom, in a show, okay? And this, what ends up happening, social facilitation, right? Social group facilitation, which makes it easier. So under this one is when we're being watched by others, we tend to perform better when others are watching. Okay, now next thing you need to write is typically this only happens with things that we know, like we've learned well, or it's easy. Okay, so for example, if you're in theater or dance or anything that you perform in front of people and you've been practicing, you tend to do better the day of the show because other people are watching. So that's social facilitation. Now there is this thing called the Dodsons Law, and I want you to just write it down. And Yerkes-Dodson, we're gonna go into this a little bit later. So Yerkes-Dodson law has to do with, it's called the law of arousal. And arousal here is just basically the arousal of your central nervous system. So for instance, like if you have very high arousal, means that you're like very, very anxious, or you need your central nervous system stimulated. And then low arousal would be that, you tend to be a little bit more calm or kind of sleepy. We'll talk a little bit more on that. But social facilitation, what ends up happening with this is that there is an arousal level that occurs when others are watching. If you have too high of an arousal, you may want to add this in there, you're going to get very, very nervous, and you tend not to perform as well. And then low arousal is you're kind of like bored or whatever. You also don't perform as good. Okay, so you kind of want a balance. We'll talk a lot more about this when it comes to motivation. Okay, so there is also what's called social inhibition, which is basically when you are being watched by others, right, in a performance, but you're going to perform poorly because others are watching. And this usually happens with tasks that are difficult or you don't know them well. Okay, so that's that. Now we're going to move on to the next one, which is social loafing, my favorite. So social loafing is when you are working in a group of people, you're going to tend to make less effort. Okay, so when we are working with people, right, this is why group projects don't always work, because everybody in the group is not going to put as much effort as they would if they were being graded individually. Now, the only time social loafing, when you're working in groups, if you are not, and add this in there, if you are not being measured independently, then social loafing occurs. Okay, you kind of like lean on everybody in the group. So, perfect example, always group projects. This is why so many people don't like them, because nobody puts as much effort as possible. However, this is why when I assign any type of group project, it's always individually graded. Okay, then you have de-individualization. This is basically when this happens when you are in a large group, when we're in a large group and we lose our sense of identity because we're in a group of people, right? We're not singled out. And then what ends up happening, so that's one part, right? You're in a group of people, lose your identity because they can't single you out. You're in a group. And then the next little bullet is that um, you lose a sense of personal responsibility. So we tend to act like the larger group. Okay. Um, so, for instance, if there's a food fight in the cafeteria and everybody's throwing, guess what? You're gonna probably join in because you're not singled out. If you go to a concert, right? Another perfect example, and there's like a mosh pit or they're dancing, you tend to also want to dance or do the same behavior that the group is doing. This is why you see in sports events when people start getting really rowdy, like especially in soccer, you always usually see like, riots or like a mob of people rushing. That would be de-individualization, and that happens because you're kind of you're not singled out, and you could kind of fall in there. Um, an example of this de-individualization is going to be the Stanford prison experiment, and please write that down. We'll talk a little bit more in the class about that because that is a social experiment that basically taught us a couple things about what happens with in people's roles, but also what happens when we're in a group of people and we kind of lose our identity. Okay, now we're going to the next one, which is group polarization. And group polarization is when we are in a group of people with like-minded, okay, and you're discussing a belief or attitude, then that's going to grow stronger throughout the discussion. Okay. So when you're with, and I'll say it again, when you're with a group of people that are like-minded, that think like you, and you're talking about a belief or an attitude or something like that, it's going to get stronger with the people that also agree. Okay. Um, so group polarization, it could be good if you are, for let's say like self-help groups, right? That you all think the same thing of we want to get better. And then you tend to then those ideas get stronger. The negative with group polarization is that if you're in a group of people that hates other groups, right, or dislike something, that idea is going to get stronger. Okay. So this is where a lot of your extreme groups come out of. But we could even talk, put it down a level with, like, for example, you don't like somebody and you start talking and you're gonna go talk to somebody that they don't like them either. So what ends up happening, that like dislike for the person gets stronger amongst that group. Okay, and we could talk more of some examples in class, but it's interesting how this happens. So like when you get like politicians they think the same way, they're going to, their ideas and their beliefs are going to get stronger because they're in this group that also agrees. And then everybody else's belief also strengthens. So very much like a confirmation bias plays into this as well. But it can also be like an issue where you have racial profiling or groups, right, that are going to be prejudiced against others. All right, so then we have groupthink, and groupthink is when you create an unrealistic group decision. You come to an unrealistic group decision that occurs when you want to keep harmony of the group and you ignore the realistic thinking. Okay, so this is basically when you're with a group of people, okay, and you all make a decision and you know that it's not a great decision to make, but in order to keep the peace, you're going to go with it. Okay, so I'll give you an example of a small scale of group thinking. So let's say you're with a group of friends and they're deciding what you want to eat, right? Like, let's go out to a restaurant and they pick Chipotle, let's say. And you know from experience, right? And a few people know from experience that every time they've eaten at that Chipotle, they've gotten super sick. But in order to keep the peace with the group, okay, you're all gonna go with it, even though you know it's really not a great idea, but to keep everybody in harmony and not create conflict, you all go with it. And then you go and everybody gets sick. And then you're like, oh, I knew that was gonna happen, right? Hindsight bias. Um, but that is groupthink in a very minimal like example. There is bigger consequences of groupthink. Like one good example would be like the Bay of Pigs. They usually use this for this class, this example. Bay of Pigs, the United States was like, oh yeah, we should go and attack Cuba, but they didn't really plan it out, and they were like, yes, yes, yes. And then that did not work out. Basically, the soldiers that went that were from Cuba were basically attacked and taken. They had no backup. So, anyway, that's usually the example. And then the last one is going to be crowding effect. And crowding effect is when you're in a crowd, right? And it's very much like kind of like group polarization mixed with social facilitation. The crowding effect is that when you're in a crowd of people, your reactions or your arousal gets strengthened, right, by other people's reactions. So if, for example, comedians, they love this. If a group of people start laughing, everybody starts laughing. This is why when we're watching shows, right, like sitcoms, they'll always put the audio of a bunch of people laughing in order for you then to also want to laugh. Or when you're in a crowd with people in a game, or like even a pep rally, right? People start screaming, you start screaming, right? It's kind of like part of the whole thing. Okay. And that is it, guys. I will see ya later.